people. We almost feel like sometimes we could do with being equipped. So rather than passing the buck, we need to sometimes hold on to the potato and enjoy the taste and the toppings that go with it. So what I've done is I've just put together 7, if you like, conversation starter questions. And I thought it would be good that as a group, we start to have this conversation. There's no right or wrong answer. We're in it together. It's as safe a place as we can make it to that. So yeah, the idea is let's have a conversation. So as a group, let's start with sort of the first questions. So what's our interpretation of child criminal exploitation, and how are young people groomed and exploited? So from our experience as professionals, what have we seen and experienced from that? Would anyone like to have a go at starting this conversation off?
I'll go, Mike, if you want.
Okay.
I feel like I will need to wait first to see if anyone else want to go before I start. I think for me, criminal exploitation is probably one of the harder ones to kind of identify. I think sometimes, unless you really are looking into what's happening, because you've got a crime that's taking place. So I think one of the things that you can look for when you're looking at CCEs, when what is the actual crime. So I think a lot of the times we can see quite commonly across drug trafficking and in that sense of things. However, I think if we can identify the crime first and then work our way backwards, so that sometimes when it's actually happening and it's going forward, we don't know until, say, for example, for a police perspective, the crime comes in, possession with, a certain amount of I don't know, drugs on them, and then you can work your way backwards. But then I think when we're looking at the grooming aspect when it comes to CSE and CCE, really, is that you can see that there's a level of manipulation. And I think when you're looking at the child and you can see that there's a level of manipulation and unawareness for this child to a lot of the times feel that they are in control. A lot of the times there's a lot of unmet needs with the child, high vulnerability that's taken advantage of. So I think for me, when we're looking at CC in its broad definition, we're looking at a child who is being manipulated or coerced into committing a criminal act for the purposes. It doesn't always have to be an adult, but for another person. But that doesn't always come across as clear as it sounds, because sometimes it might just be, oh, a young person's been caught with drugs and that's all you've got. And then it's not until you unpick that kind of situation, how did it come about? Who's this for? What their element of choice in the situation, was there element of manipulation, was there imbalance of power between the relationship of the person committing the crime and the person who's kind of groomed them into that position. So I think with CCE, it's simple in its definition, but complex to identify the grooming, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Caris. So from what Caris has explained so far, are there any questions that people would like to ask, or comments or reflections on what you've just heard?
We've got one in the chat, Mike.
Okay, yeah.
I think children often don't see themselves as victims, either as part of the grooming process, made to think that they are involved and valued within the environment and not a victim of exploitation. Really hard to identify with young people.
It is, and I think a lot of times the language that we use as professionals is not the language that young people use. So as an example, young people very rarely say, oh, I'm doing county lines. It's sort of a professional term. They might talk about doing lines, but the language that young people use is very different to how we would describe that as well. And so there's a big piece of research going on nationally around trying to understand the language that both people that are exploiting are using, and also language that young people are using within that. And the Children's Society has started to do a piece of work around that. The difficulty is, like everything else, language changes, and it also changes from community to community, and it changes from sort of the north of England down to the south. So an example would be in Darlaston, if a young person said they're going on a mission, it would mean that they're looking for girls to pick up and have sex with. Whereas in Blakeney, if a young person says they're going on a mission, quite often it means that they're going on a bike ride or they're going out of Blakeney. And so within miles of each other, language is different. And so I think you're right, sort of understanding the environment and the language, but understanding the context within community is important as well. So
I think there's a good. Oh, sorry,
no, go on.
I was just going to say, in terms of the grooming process, and the comment in the chat as well, unfortunately, if a perpetrator has done a successful grooming job, that young person will not identify themselves as a victim of exploitation. I think if that, and that's probably what makes it difficult, is because if you can groom and get a person into a position whereby they don't feel that they are forced or coerced, or they're being helped, then they're not going to present as what we would think is a typical victim. So sometimes that might look like a confidence, that might look like there'll be an element of fear there maybe, but the fear might not necessarily be towards the perpetrator. The fear might be more towards the consequences of maybe police, or consequences of opposing rivals and things like that. The fear sits in a different place, and I think when we use the word victim, sometimes that comes with a perception of what a victim should look like and how a victim should act. But I think when we're looking at a successful grooming process, you're less likely to see that until things go terribly wrong. And a lot of the time, what we do talk about is that when things go wrong, and we talk about this could happen, you could end up in, for example, you mentioned county lines, Mike, we can go out and we can speak to young people about, you're going to end up in a house that's, a crack den full of needles, and that does happen. But depending on the type of criminal exploitation, sometimes you'll have other organised groups that, you've got a hotel Airbnb and it's very organised and it's very clean, and, that element of risk doesn't necessarily doesn't sit there, and they're not exposed to that. And I think one of the things from a perpetrator's point of view is that if we can get them on side and make them feel like they're part of this, they're more likely to stay on. They're more likely, because it's a business model for them. So a lot of the times, I think we talk about how things can go terribly wrong, and they do go wrong a lot of the time, and things do happen, but not all the time. And sometimes that honeymoon period can last for a very long time. And what we see is that this young person's groomed into a process and moves up and up and up. So I think what we see as professionals as a victim, we have to kind of change that sometimes and understand that a successful grooming process won't make a child present as a typical victim as what we expect to see.
You're right. And talking again about language, young people don't see themselves as victims. I think sometimes we forget that young people are risk takers. And if they take risk in an environment that they see as safe, then they'll do that. And often within the grooming process, it's a little bit of an adrenaline rush to get on a train without being caught, to go to another place, to meet people that they've not met before, and interact and do the things that's happening, like you say, within those houses or places. Is a risk, and quite often young people are up for that. And what you say is right, with that safety net of the person or the perpetrator that's exploiting young people. there's almost a sense of invincibility there as well. And for me, what we're seeing more and more is young people going through that process of almost, I'm invincible, I don't have to talk to you because I've got the backing of. But then quite often they're knocked back into place and brought down a level by either, getting mugged or a planned mugging or a planned beating, just to make them see that, you might feel like you're the boss in this situation and we're here to do things with you, but at the end of the day, we've got you. You're working with us. And the other thing to say is quite often young people, especially young people that have worked their way up the ladder, see this as a job. We've had young people that have talked about having employees, people who run for them, who work for them. And so that manipulation and coercion is almost embedded right from the start, but done through ways of risk-taking, through giving young people what they want, but then almost like knocking them back into place. So it is a process, and it's in a lot of cases a well thought out process as well, by people that are quite intelligent and know what they're doing.
Would you say that I suppose I'll throw it out to the group. Would anybody say that there's a clear difference in that grooming process from the CSE side to the CCE side? Because I feel like I can see a difference in terms of what you were just talking about, in terms of the power and the control and almost the giving of that power and control opposed to the taking of sometimes in the CSE world. But I don't know if anybody else can see any kind of like differences between the two. I'm just looking in the chat, Mike.
Yeah, it's okay, I think.
Should I read it out, or do you want to read it out?
Yeah, go for it.
I've got from Jan, it says, totally agree, exactly the same in abortion services. We start with an unwanted pregnancy and then we have to work backwards, often identifying an inappropriate age relationship, coercion, use of drugs, alcohol, which they see as normal. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jan.
And I was going to ask Jan, so when that happens and you're working your way backwards, what are the services that you would have to refer into after that, or is it something that you guys unpick, or does it go to someone else?
Hi, we would refer into social services, sometimes mental health services and GP, but mostly social services, or if a young lady decides to continue the pregnancy, it would be the safeguarding midwife within maternity services.
Okay. Do you guys have any do you go into the SARC at all, referring to the SARC ever, or?
No, I don't think we do.
Because I know that I suppose when you looking at here in terms of like the inappropriate age relationship, etc., so SARC sometimes have additional services if you can identify that there's been a coercion, that you've got here coercion and control, etc. There is SARC services as well, which is good in terms of an onward referral, and they've got access to like IDVAs and stuff like that.
I should have mentioned the police as well, obviously, when we're talking about young people. Yeah, but thank you for that. And that was one of the reasons why I've joined this session, is just to see if there's anything else that we can do to identify and deal with obvious exploitation that we identify. And as we are the main abortion provider for the Midlands, we just thought it was really important that we joined you today. So thank you for that.
No, thank you, Jan. So really, this slide, we won't go through all the conversation starters this morning, because there's other things that we want to carry on with. But these are just questions that, for me, I've had conversations with other professionals about as well, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do a hot potato session. So, and these have been conversations not in supervision, but while we've been sat in an office or walking the streets of Walsall on detached, and people have said, you know what, I don't know why this young person is refusing to talk to me, but there's something going on. You know, what happens, you know, I put a young person forward for a national referral mechanism. What happens if it comes back and it isn't positive when there's signs there, but we haven't quite got to the root of it yet? Right down to almost simple things like, how do we talk to young people? How do we talk to teenagers? How do we build that rapport up? How do we almost gain that trust when, as we've already talked about, often we're seen as people with power. And then the other thing that we're going to come on to today as well is about understanding the communities within Walsall and what those are, some of those communities look like from a CSC and CCE perspective as well. So I suppose this is just sort of a foundation looking at where we're hoping to go. Is everyone happy to move on, or shall we have a look at another question? What are people thinking? Okay. So a little bit about the team, who we are. So the Exploitation Team, our hub, is a gateway service for professionals to discuss young people, also missing episodes, locations, and CSE and CCE. We're made up and we work in partnership with police, youth justice, social workers, youth workers, street teams who are the commission partner within Walsall, and we have 2 exploitation and missing coordinators alongside Caris, who's the violence reduction worker as well. As a team, we hold daily triage sessions where we discuss young people and specific exploitation cases, and also bring attention to potential new cases. So we just discuss young people, locations, and families and adults. The cases that are discussed, if young people are missing, if they've got links to gangs or groups, and if they're actively involved in CCE or CSE. From a professional point of view and from the exploitation and missing coordinators, what they do is if a social worker or professionals involved with young people, then they will be notified that the young person's been discussed at triage, and if there's any questions or conversations. The beauty about triage is that it also in some ways maps young people's missing episodes. And so if young people are missing 3 times in a row, then that automatically causes a strategy meeting with professionals that are involved with that young person. So although this is sort of the mechanics of how the team works, so this part of the work is not directly face-to-face work with young people. It's discussions with other professionals about young people. Caris, have you got anything else to add?
Sorry, I was just going to say, just as well that there's the referral mechanism into there, so there'll be like a recommended. So a lot of the time, street teams will pick up work directly through the triage process as well. So sometimes there is opportunity, should I say, for them to access that support directly through the triage process. I think you've covered most stuff within it. It might be worth just kind of mentioning that there's also a violence triage as well that's beginning, and that's its beginning stages of being developed, where it's going to be a similar kind of process, but there's no referral into that. It's police led, and it comes out from police and then into social care and the other remits. And I suppose I was just wondering as well if anyone's ever done an exploitation assessment.
Good question.
Has anyone ever seen one, or has everyone ever? This is the first time you've ever heard of an exploitation assessment. I was just wondering, because it's what we function off really as a team, isn't it, in terms of the exploitation? It might just be new to everyone. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it might be worth us sort of talking through what's on the assessment so that people have a bit of an idea.
Oh, okay. So, okay. Do you want me to talk through it, or do you want to talk through it, Mike?
Yeah, we can do this together. Yeah.
Cool. So the assessment, I'm wondering if I could get a blank one up, but yeah, so the assessment essentially is a document whereby the outcome of that is to look at whether a person is either going to be low, medium, or high. So low risk would mean a person is at risk of exploitation or vulnerable to exploitation. So that is like a large kind of scope. So this is where you're looking at your young people who are highly vulnerable. There may be some kind of indicators as to that there could be exploitation, but there isn't anything to kind of evidence that. Then you've got medium risk, which is a person who's been targeted for the purposes of exploitation. So this isn't that the exploitation is taking place, however, they've been targeted, they've been approached. So this may be for your CSE, this may be a person who's been online and a person's approached them and said to them that they've offered a sexual exchange for money, for example, and there's evidence of grooming, or you've got a young person who's going through a grooming process and that's like being identified and they've disclosed that to an adult. And then you've got your high risk, which is where there's evidence that that person is actually being identified. So for example, for criminal exploitation, that could be a young person who has been missing for 3 days. They've said that they've been given drugs from a local gang member. They've gone to Liverpool and then for a couple of days they've been found with drugs and then they've come back. And then that's kind of where the NRM goes in as well, because you potentially got evidence of trafficking as well as criminal exploitation. So that's the intended outcome of the assessment, and that's the whole reason why it comes through. Within that discussion, you'll have police, street teams, and all the triage partners that Mike's already mentioned. If they are medium or high risk, then that will move forward to a disruption meeting, and that's when police and other partners are actively trying to put in measures to disrupt the exploitation that's going on. In terms of the assessment and what it looks like itself, Mike, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, sure. So the assessment itself has been streamlined a little bit since before. It's a work in progress, if I'm totally honest with you. As a team, we kind of change things on a regular basis because things are changing within exploitation as well. So within the assessment, it'll ask things like locations of where young people are known to be hanging out. It'll ask things around sort of peer groups. So any known young people that the young person hangs out with, or adults that the young person hangs out with as well. One of the things that's just been added, but I don't think it's gone live yet, are things around social media. So do young people have a known Snapchat or Insta or Facebook or whatever? And if so, then quite often that's put as part of the assessment as well. So the idea is that it builds a picture of who that young person is and the type of I suppose activity or involvement of others that young person is being involved in as well. So it's quite a detailed assessment. I think one of our bugbears, if we're honest, is that quite often people don't have all the information that we're asking for. So we have to sometimes do a little bit of research and have conversations with professionals as well. But I suppose the main thing is that we get to know the young people we're working with as well, to be able to fill out the assessment properly and to give the best information so that the right people can then work with that young person. Yeah, have I missed anything out, Caris?
No, I think it's a good snapshot. I suppose it's probably just worth mentioning that is the referral pathway into our team as well, and for our support. So if you have got a young person who you do suspect or they've got vulnerabilities or they've made a disclosure, that's the pathway into the team. So it might be worth, I don't know if people haven't heard of it before, I don't know if it's worth sharing it after this, Mike, and just sending it out.
We can send the email out with the attachment. That's not a problem. Amanda, you asked what is NRM, so we can cover that now as well. So the NRM is the National Referral Mechanism. I always get these two mixed up. Is it Children's Society or Barnardo's that usually lead on?
Barnardo's.
Barnardo's, yeah, thank you. So Barnardo's usually lead on it, and it's basically an assessment that looks at whether or not a young person is not just exploited, but ways in which they might be exploited. So it's a bit of a tick box exercise in some parts, but it looks at things, I suppose, based around contextual safeguarding. So it looks at the community, it looks at sort of criminality, it looks at a whole host of things, and just around sexual and criminal exploitation, it's around human trafficking and modern day slavery as well. And I think there's about 100 in the sort of maybe more tick box exercises with then a bit of an explanation from the professional as to why that young person might be at risk of. So then Barnardo's, they're the holders of NRM. So then what happens is social worker and another professional will have a meeting with Barnardo's just to talk through and try to put a bit of a safety assessment in for that young person, especially around maybe violent incidents. And you know, more and more in Walsall, what we've been doing is working with families around risk assessing their home, because we'll come on to this in a bit, but there's been incidents in Walsall where adults have gone into people's houses and, you know, smashed TVs looking for young people and adults that live there. So part of our role with social workers has been to work with families about, you know, assessing that risk, which is quite a sad thing to do, really, especially when families have younger children, and you kind of do it in a creative way of, okay, so if someone you don't know comes to the door and is looking a bit aggressive and shouting at mummy and daddy, what do you do? And we sort of walk through, you go upstairs or you go to a place that's safe. If not upstairs, then, you know, and sort of working that out. So a lot of our work has been around that as well recently. We will send a copy of the exploitation assessment out, Aisha. That's not a problem. We'll do that today. Is there anything I've missed, Caris, from that point of view?
I was just going to say, just in terms of the NRM as well, it's specific to a person being trafficked. So
yeah,
there has to be, when we're looking at the NRM, there has to be almost a person moving from one location to another. That's the simplest way to kind of put it. So you wouldn't necessarily put in an NRM for a person where there isn't a movement of location. So it's specific to a person being trafficked. So where that location's moving, that's where the NRM kind of comes in its simplest form. It's not necessarily something that you would do for every single exploitation case. However, when you're looking, especially with the CE and the criminal exploitation, it kind of feeds in.
Yeah.
And also as well, I will try my best to stop using acronyms because we say it a lot. We'll say CC, or we say NRM with the assumption that everybody understands what that is. So I will try my best to be a bit more conscious to not use them as well.
Yeah. No,
so
likewise.
if you need to catch me out, just catch us out. Just write in the chat. Like stop.
Yeah. So if we move on, so I suppose we've covered this a little bit, but it'd be good to go into maybe some more detail. So I suppose the easy answer to what does criminal exploitation look like is it looks probably different to every young person we work with, if I'm honest with you. But as Caris has already said, criminal exploitation is child abuse. That's the level of seriousness that we want to get across today. Yeah, it's not young people being a little bit aggressive or being whatever. It is child abuse. And it is where young people are being manipulated and coerced into committing crimes. Thought it'd be interesting just to look at a few examples from what I've seen about how young people have been manipulated and coerced into committing crimes and criminal exploitation. So probably something that has sort of arisen over the last 2 to 3 years in Walsall in particular. I don't think it wasn't a regular trend up until recently, is that threat to family, friends, and to a young person's own life. We've talked previously about adults turning up and basically ransacking people's homes looking for a young person that was in debt to them. This is happening. It is becoming a bit of a trend now in certain areas of Walsall, which means that from a professional point of view, we have to be careful when we're doing home visits to see young people and families. So we do our own risk assessment when working with families and young people, especially in home visits. Probably one of the main things that I see, I don't know about you, Caris, is the idea of being family. Young people often talk about, well, my mum and dad aren't really my family. My family are, and they mention a group that are their family. The idea of being part of something, the idea of having that protection, but also being able to protect others. The idea of reputation is something that we're seeing with young people as a main cause of them wanting to be involved. We talked before about the thrill of doing something, of being able to get on a train and travel the country without necessarily paying for a ticket, and then sort of the thrill of not knowing what comes next. There is more and more an attitude of being untouchable or indestructible or whatever, which, in my opinion, and it isn't necessarily a professional opinion, it's a personal opinion, is some of the reasons why there's a lot of violence amongst young people, because when you've got a group of young people that feel that they can't be touched and then they come together and meet, there's a bit of toxic masculinity going on. And so we've seen within Walsall levels of violence, both in communities and also towards different communities as well, which brings us on to sort of that need to protect their community and their peers and friends, and then deal with others from out of area. So when we work with young people and we maybe take them to a youth centre that isn't in their community, it's in an area that they feel uncomfortable. Quite often, young people will fidget, they'll be nervous, they'll look over their shoulders. They're almost ultra aware of everything that's going on, and it feels like they're actually mapping how they'd get out if a young person came in that they didn't get on with. And that's a level of anxiety that I see a lot with young people. For young people as well, maybe they see it as a lifestyle, a part of the community. Often when I talk to young people about what they're doing, they say things like, well, what do you expect? We come from this area, and then they name the area that they come. And it's almost like a badge of honour that because they're from this area, that they can do this. And so for criminal exploitation in particular, it looks different per young person you work with, but the main thing is that they are manipulated and coerced. And quite often in South Asian communities, maybe in particular, the manipulation and coercion comes from family and friends within community. So it's something that's happening within community rather than young people moving out of community to be exploited. Caris, anything else to add to that?
No, I think you've covered it, especially with the friends and the family. And I think one of the things that we've seen recently is that this idea of becoming part of a family and almost turning against your own family members. So I know that me and Mike were in a session not too long ago, and a young person was explaining that he was a part of one area side and his cousin was a part of another, an opposing side, and that now the two of them no longer got on because there were opposing sides and they live in different areas across Walsall. Now, to me, that's shocking because when I think about my cousins, and that's my sister's, that's going to be my mum's sister's daughter, and there's Christmases together, there's birthdays together, there's growing up together, there's playing together, and that there's this level of kind of, like we say, manipulation and coercion that can sever those ties. And I think when we look at stuff and we see it and it seems so irrational from an adult's perspective, I think the more entrenched and the successful grooming process of this kind of manipulation and coercion, you'll see those kind of drastic measures that can take place. And whether or not there was a violent incident, what would happen then? What would happen? Would you have a cousin opposing a cousin? Do you know what I mean? And causing serious harm. So I think one of the things that we are seeing is that it's coming from inside family, but we're seeing it separate families as well.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because alongside sort of the manipulation and coercion that we see, that there is something about power that runs as a thread through it all, and so from little things like an elder within the group might ask a young person to go and do something, and then for that young person who's been asked, it is yet again a badge of honour because an elder has asked me to go and do it. And so there is a power play within all types of exploitation, but particularly within criminal exploitation, there is that power. And for people that are kind of exploiting and grooming young people, it's like they give power to young people on the one hand, and then they take it away on the other to make a point and to make a statement. And quite often the taking away is quite a violent process of young people getting beaten, or young people being asked to do something that even goes against their own family. So we've had young people that have been asked to steal the car keys of family members so that they can go and do things. And that's what young people have done because of that fear, but also the power that the people that are asking actually hold. And so it's really difficult at times to break down, as we've already said, this way in which young people are entrapped into this, because it's almost like the mind has been almost like they've been brainwashed into doing this as well. So
I was going to say as well, Mike, just because I know that some people have asked around like trends of Walsall, is that it does change as well, and the themes do change across the areas and the boroughs in Walsall. So when you're looking more on your, I can't remember if it's west or east, you'll let me know the block switch side of stuff. You know, there'll be a mixture of things that's going on, but maybe we might see a little bit more of a theme around cars being used and cars being stolen, young people being used to steal cars, giving car keys, etc. in exchange, whereas you might see a different kind of type of exploitation in terms of you might see a bit more of kind of money, funneling money, and you might see a bit more of drugs, etc. in your other, you know, your south side or your south of Warsaw, and that all kind of will kind of change. But I think one of the things that we are seeing, I don't know if you agree, Mike, is that there just seems to be an increasing level of correlation between exploitation and violence in Warsaw, and we're seeing that more and more on the increase.
Yeah, definitely. You're right there, and I think with Walsall neighbouring other boroughs, you know, and not just boroughs, but you know, Birmingham, Sandwell, Dudley, Wolverhampton. We also have other people coming in from out of town into Walsall and grooming young people and exploiting young people as well. And so we'll come on to this in a little bit, but that's a good point, Caris. The fact that when I first started working in Walsall 16 years ago, people in Beechdale generally stuck to Beechdale. People in Palfrey generally stuck to people in Palfrey. There was a sense of community and a sense in which people took ownership, both positively and negatively within those communities, but you could kind of work out who the key players were. If you fast forward in time to now, and some of this is due to social media and the ease in which you can talk to people from across the country and even, you know, Europe and the world. Young people are making contact with other young people, so their place where they live might be Beechdale, but their community might be in Penderford. And so we're seeing young people, not all young people, but some young people, moving out of where stereotypically you'd think they'd be, if that makes sense. So that's another trend that is happening as well. If we're okay to move on a little bit further. So, and yet again, I can send out this study, but Nottingham University did a study, the Youth and Community course did a study around how COVID has affected young people and how exploitation has almost like increased sort of during the pandemic. And hopefully this will help us see maybe where we are today. So going back to March 2020, sadly, when the pandemic first struck. So obviously, not just amongst young people, but adults as well, mental health deteriorated. Amongst young people, there were high rates of young people self-harming and using substance misuse. What's interesting was, while young people that were with the youth offending team, while orders remained low across the country, it's important to understand that young people and children were still in dangerous situations, because what they were doing was they were complying with the statutory orders because workers couldn't physically come out and see them. So what workers would do is they'd phone them. So they were complying with the statutory orders, but also they were complying with the orders of the perpetrators. And so what they were doing were things like, if you remember, way back in March 2020, you'd have half an hour to go for a walk a day, and so young people would use that time to go and do the bidding of people that were exploiting them, and some of that would, because of the reduced face-to-face contact between professionals and children, and also professionals not being able to identify exactly where young people were. On the phone call, if young people say they're at home, then you kind of had to take their word for it, unless it was on Teams or WhatsApp. What else was interesting was that young people moved away from the network travel, and so incidents around young people being manipulated and coerced to steal cars was high on the list, and that's kind of a trend that's still happening even now. And what I got from this was around ID fraud as well, was also on the increase. So that was for young people who maybe were 16, 17, who were maybe too young to drive but looked old enough to, people would get them ID to go and be able to hire cars and vehicles as well. So when we talk about, this is a highly strategic way of working from people that are exploiting young people here. The other thing was that county lines related violence became more severe, with an increase in the average stab wounds of those going to accident and emergency. And also there was an increase in grooming, both for criminal sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation amongst male and female as well. So it were young men that were equally a victim of sexual exploitation as young women, and also young women equally a victim of criminal exploitation as young men. And although it hasn't raised its head as much in Walsall, in neighbouring towns and cities, the rise in violence from girl to girl has increased as well. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit now in Walsall, but more often than not, sort of youth violence is predominantly young men focused. Anything you want to add to that, Caris? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, I was going to say no. I think you've covered a lot of it, and it's just one thing that I did think that you sparked in my head just was around the compliance issue, and us as professionals, sometimes we have expectations, or we have things that young people have to comply with, and just being aware of those competing demands for a young person who's being exploited. And I suppose it takes me back a little bit when you think that the pandemic kind of, in a weird way, allowed children to, I could imagine in their minds, to actually manage those competing demands a little bit better, because I think sometimes the expectations that we have as professionals, especially on statutory orders, etc., we sometimes can increase the risk level for the young person depending on what the ask is from the perpetrator. So that when you said that, it kind of just stuck out to me in my head that would be one of the effects that I wouldn't necessarily think of naturally in my own mind. So it's just a reflection, really.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think what we're seeing now in 2022, when we've come out of a pandemic and lockdown, is kind of a progression. So it isn't that what we saw in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic isn't connected in any way. It's like that there is a serious link and progression of how exploitation is almost evolving in Walsall as well. And as professionals, it's important that we listen to what young people and local residents within communities are saying, because sometimes that is sort of a little bit of a sign about what's going on. That we observe what young people are doing and what people within communities are doing as well. And also the key thing is that we do what we're doing today, which is, as people from a variety of different agencies, we talk and we share information, so that we don't just hold it for ourselves, but we share it with others so that they can be aware too. And I think that communication aspect of it is really crucial in some ways to stopping young people from getting hurt, injured, or even dying through exploitation, whether criminal or sexual. Okay. So what I'd like us to do now, and yet again, any questions, then please put it in the chat. There will be an opportunity for questions to be asked as we go on. But yeah, as you can see, this is a map of Walsall, split up into different areas, and obviously within those areas there's communities as well. I think it's important to understand, you know, the last census, I think Walsall was a town of 283,000 people, so quite a large population. Walsall split into 4 localities. So you've got North locality, which is Brown Hills, Aldridge. No, sorry, it isn't. It's Bloxwich East, Bloxwich West, Birchills, Leamore, Blakenall. You've got the south, which is St Matthews, Palfrey, Paddock. You've got the east, which is Feasey and Aldridge, and Brown Hills. And then you've got the west, which is Willenhall and Bentley and Darlaston. The reason why I've shown this map is twofold. Firstly, I think sometimes we don't see how big Walsall is, and we don't see the different areas. You know, we might travel to see a family or a young person or go to a school, but actually Walsall is quite a big place. And then secondly, what I want to do from this slide is just share a little bit around the change in communities and how, from an exploitation point of view, that has kind of impacted how we work too. So I suppose to start off with, areas that at one point we thought were white British communities, such as areas like Blakenall, Beechdale, Bloxwich, which historically, you know, have had some far right views, are becoming more integrated. I wouldn't say they're quite cohesive, but they are becoming integrated. Areas like Pleck, Palfrey, Paddock and St Matthews, which historically have been identified as maybe South Asian, so Pakistani, Bengali, Gujarati. People have actually described those communities as kind of the gateway for other communities coming in. So your asylum seekers and your refugees. So what over the last few years has been that areas that you see as predominantly white have changed significantly. In areas like Bloxwich West and Bloxwich East and Darlaston, there's families from the African continent that are living around there, in Pleck, Palfrey, etc. There's an increase in Afghan, Somali, Iraqi families that are moving into those communities. And so when we talk about communities, it's important as professionals that we understand the change that communities are going through. And sometimes the only way we can do that is by going and driving through communities or walking through communities. The issue that this has raised from an exploitation point of view is that there's been vulnerable families where maybe English isn't their first, second, third, or even fourth language, moving into communities where already there's high levels of crime, exploitation, and also racist undertones. And so what we're seeing is in a lot of these communities an upsurge in violence as well. Even though there's always been some level of violence in some of the communities, it's kind of different because it's race related as well. And so Walsall is a changing place. And obviously, from a young person point of view, that has a major impact. I was in a school last year, and a secondary school, and I talked to the head of pastoral care, and his main issue was that within that school, there are around about 30 different languages spoken by young people. And for a lot of those young people, like I said before, English wasn't their first language. So there was division within that. And you actually saw that when you walked out into the playground and you had groups of Pakistani young men from different communities, but separate. You had Romanian young people in the playground in a group, but separate. Czech Republic young people, but separate, etc., etc. And all it took were one young person to either walk past or look at someone funny or say something that the other person didn't understand. And it were like lighting the touch paper, it just went up. And so in and amongst sort of the conversation around exploitation, what we've also got is the fact that communities are changing as well. And as Caris has already spoken about, a lot of the young people we work with come in as high risk, highly vulnerable, and then get drawn into what's already going on within the community because they want to fit in or they need to fit in. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of as well within Walsall, which is another trend, which is also not just affecting how criminal exploitation works, but also child sexual exploitation as well. Caris, anything else? Oh, you're on mute again.
I tell you, I should just keep it off mute, really, shouldn't I? No, I think you've kind of covered most on that topic. I don't think there's anything in particular for exploitation that I'm thinking of.
No. What about from a violence point of view?
I think from a violence perspective, I think location is everything. I think it's one of the things that we see feed into a lot of the conflict, because I think from what we said before, when we're looking at the family aspect and when we're looking at different things, the locations and the communities are a part of that. And I think when we're looking at violence, when we're looking at protecting those communities, when we're looking at the transitions between, changes in the community, whether that be someone from an opposing side, whether that be someone from a different country, whether that be different, it's changing the identity of communities. But I think with the transition, it is kind of increasing the violence as well, because I think it means that young people can't be quite mobile. I think that's one of the things we have to realise as well. So we have the freedom to kind of go through Walsall. I can go through Walsall, I can go through Brown Hills, I can go through Willenhall, and there's no repercussions, and I'm quite free to do so. I think with our young people, that's one of the things that I'm noticing across the board, is that they've lost that freedom, a lot of them, and it doesn't mean that they have to be affiliated as well to anything in particular. but they've lost that autonomy, and everybody wants their autonomy. It's a right for you to have that autonomy, but I think it's one of the needs and one that our young people don't have at the minute, because they can't freely travel without fear of repercussion or violence.
Yeah, and
just to be
to
be mindful of that in our practice as well. One of the things that me and Mike have to do a lot of the times is that we have to check with our young people. Are you okay to go in that area? So for example, if we've got positive activities, we have to have that consultation with the young person. Is this okay? And I would say for other people as well, when you work with young people and you've got these suspicions, just be mindful of that as well, in terms of asking the questions. And is it all right for you to be here? Is there anything that you need to be put in place? Just because, location is everything, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose that the change in Walsall as well, that are going back when I first started working in Walsall 16 years ago, that there were schools that were predominantly known as white British schools. So you've got your old Frank F. Harrison, which is now Bloxwich Academy. When I first started working in that area, 99% white British. Got young people came from communities that were very far right thinking. You fast forward to now, and talking to the principal at the school, it's about 60% white British, 40% other, and that kind of reflects the community around that school. What you've also got is you've got young people from areas like Blakeney that don't necessarily have a secondary school in their community, so will travel to Sheffield Ormiston or Brownhills or Bloxwich Academy or further afield. And so what's happening is young people are having to move out of their community to get education, which sometimes puts them at risk because they've got issues and beef with young people from not necessarily that school, but that area and that community. And so what Carissa is saying is right. We need to be mindful of this. We've got young people from Palfrey that are travelling to Aldridge as a school. So although young people really don't travel from, in our experience, what they are doing is they're having to travel for education, but sometimes that puts them at risk as well. Yeah, that's right, Jan. Quite often young people would prefer to go maybe out of town for an appointment rather than, go to Rushall or Birchills or wherever for that as well. There's lots more that could be talked about, sort of communities within Walsall. There's a sense in which we don't have the time to carry this on. That could be a session in itself. But it's important, I suppose the key fact is to understand it's important that young people might have an uneasiness or even a downright refusal to go to communities because of the reputation or because they've got issues with others as well.
And I suppose as well, when we're looking at, and I'll be really quick, it's going to be like a 5-second comment.
No, it's okay.
I just think as well, when we're looking at exploitation and we're looking at vulnerabilities as well, use that as in the back of your mind. That could be an indicator of something as well. When we're looking at the signs and spotting the signs, if you can see that reluctance, if you can see that kind of explore more, ask the questions, because there might be something there to unpick, and it might be something a little bit more than, oh, I just want to travel a bit further, or I just don't want to be here. That unpicking might give you a bit more information around the context of the child.
Yeah, and like we've discussed on numerous occasions, Caris and I, the impact of social media on the lives of young people cannot be underestimated. There's been young people that have not actually met other young people face to face, but have an inherent dislike for that young person, and the only time they meet is when they're going to have a fight or sort things out. And so, although social media in some aspects is a brilliant thing because it connects people to others, there's a sense in which, especially within criminal and sexual exploitation, it can be used for the wrong reasons as well. So that's also something to be mindful of. Quite often when I work with young people, I don't directly say, show us your Snapchat list, but I'll say things like, so on your social media, who's the person you've got that's furthest away from Walsall? And they might say, oh, I talked to someone in Holland, or they might say, oh, I talked to someone in Allen Rock in Birmingham. And it's just those little questions that isn't sort of poking or trying to get information, but it's just an understanding of how well known the young person is as well. So although we talk about Walsall, and Walsall still has quite an insular attitude as a people, young people through social media and travelling to schools, etc., are starting to broaden their horizon. Okay. So I suppose this is self-explanatory, but I wanted to put it there. So as professionals, we need to understand the culture of communities our young people are part of, and not just the physical communities that they live in, but also the communities that they go to and are part of as a group. We need to understand the local context that's going on within communities. And that's as simple as maybe going to the corner shop to buy a sandwich and having a conversation with the shop owner about how long they've been in the area and have you seen change. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have to be intrusive at all, but these conversations help us to have that understanding of who maybe some of the adult key players are within community. So some of the things that we can find quite easy off Walsall Council's website are things like the crime rate within the community and what that looks like. Sometimes that can be a little bit hard to interpret, but quite often you can see it. Ethnicity of communities, especially when we're looking at the change in the way that newly arrived families are coming into Walsall. Is there any provision for young people? Sadly, local authority provision has sort of been cut drastically since 2016, but there's still youth clubs out there, youth clubs such as at Blakenall Community Centre in Blakenall, Plec Youth Centre on the Wensbury Road in Plec. There's Frank F. Harrison that cover Beechdale and New Invention. So there are youth centres out there, but yet again, these are centres that are in communities that maybe young people already have issues with. But it's important to see what is there in community for young people. So what's the pull for young people to leave the community? Maybe it is as simple as there's nothing for them to do. And that boredom, which then resonates into doing other things. Where the local schools are, primary and secondary, also is an indicator as well. And importantly, access to public transport. So young people that go to Brownhill School from Blakenall, public transport there is quite intermittent. And so if they miss one bus, they have to wait quite a long time for another. If they have an after-school detention, they might have to wait a very long time for another bus to come. And so it's those risks and vulnerabilities that sometimes we have to be aware of. A close friend of mine who works as a youth worker in another local authority said this, which I thought were really pertinent to the way that we see criminal exploitation. He said that county lines does not start at the end location. It starts in their own yard. And so rather than figuring out why they went to that place, we have to figure out what pulled them out of their own community, their own yard. So these are just 5 things that for me, when I'm working with young people, I find quite interesting to have a conversation about. Yeah, the presentation will be shared, and it is being recorded, and I think it's going to go on the website at some point. Caris, anything else, or shall we move on? No, cool. Okay, so before we move on any further, I just want, you know, it feels in a way that we've talked at you today. There's a sense in which if we'd had a room and we were all in the room together, it might have been a little bit more of an open conversation and dialogue. But I just want to give space now for the next 5 minutes for any thoughts, questions, reflections on what you've heard so far. By all means, you can put them in the chat. If you feel comfortable and confident and you want to say it, then speak it. But I just want to give a few minutes for your own thoughts, questions, and reflections.
I was going to say is that if people don't feel comfortable with kind of saying it, you could always type it.
Yeah. There will be another opportunity for this as well.
From your experience, age would you say is kind of like most common that people kind of start being manipulated?
I couldn't hear the question, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I said from your like personal experience, what age would you say is quite a common age for someone to kind of start being manipulated?
For me, I don't know about you, Mike, but I think for me a lot of it's down to, it's not so much that age, but what they have access to and at what stage they start to get access to things. So it depends. Once they've got access to social media, once they can be out, once they're outside on their own, once they've got that kind of level of autonomy where perpetrators have access, I would say that's where they're more likely to be vulnerable to be groomed and targeted for exploitation. But where that happens differs in different families, doesn't it? So some families, you know, you might have a 16-year-old that doesn't have access to social media and it's very heavily monitored, whereas you might have a 10-year-old who does have access to social media and plays out on a regular basis. So for me, it's a less an age thing, but more when a person is exposed to community and potential perpetrators, and that would differ from families. But I don't know if, Mike, you've got a different perspective.
Maybe not a different perspective, but I think maybe to answer the question slightly different. So yet again, probably prior to COVID and even before that, you stereotypically kind of almost could see who would potentially be exploited and who wouldn't. So, you know, adverse childhood experiences is a good marker in this. So, you know, the fact that maybe they come from a home that sees violence, or that is, you know, high levels of deprivation. They have to travel out of community to get education. So kind of painting that picture of a young person that maybe, I don't know, to be stereotypical, might look a bit, you know, shabby in appearance. That isn't the case anymore. That has to be said. I think when it comes to almost perpetrators targeting young people, they're not going for the stereotypical anymore. They're kind of targeting young people who maybe speak up in class a little bit more, and the way that they manipulate and coerce those young people is different to the stereotypical young person that we talk about. So rather than giving them gifts of whatever, they go straight to almost like the violence side of it. So they will, maybe pin them up by the throat and threaten them to do something. So whereas in the past there was very much a grooming process, that process is changing as well. I think age-wise, it's a difficult one, because I think Caris and I have both seen young people that maybe want to be wannabe gangsters at sort of 8, 9, 10 years old. That doesn't mean that they're being exploited or groomed or manipulated or coerced, but because they have a fascination with that lifestyle and maybe that style of music or whatever, they could be more susceptible to that as well. So it's for me, it's about observing and understanding the signs as well of what young people are saying and doing and acting. We worked with one family, or I did, and the child was a grade A student at one point, and then his marks started to slip. He started coming home a little bit later. He started back chatting his mum, etc., etc. And it turns out that he got in with a crowd of older youths who were kind of bigging him up, but then were kind of getting him to do stuff. And because he was young and he had a little bit of an angelic face, possibly he could get away with a little bit more than sort of your 15, 16-year-old. So the problem is that, like we said before, around criminal and sexual exploitation, the perpetrators are changing the way that they work so often. I don't know if you agree with that, Caris. So
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think one of the things that we're seeing as well now, I suppose, being around after a few years, is that the victims of exploitation have essentially, in some aspects, they are still victims in their own right, but have also become almost recruiters / perpetrators themselves, because they've gone through this process, and that they're both victim but also part of the recruitment process as well. So I suppose when we're looking at age, we can see those who have been entrenched from a younger age, turning 16, 17, and they probably do have access to your 13, your 12-year-olds, where there can be that kind of recruitment into that process as well. So I suppose when it comes to age as well, it's a complex one, isn't it? Age, I think.
Yeah, and especially when you've got 10, 11-year-olds that are acting like 15, 16-year-olds, and in some cases even looking like 15, 16-year-olds.
Yeah,
it's a tough one.
And I suppose looking at the makeup of an adolescent and the makeup, we say that adolescence is a person isn't fully developed until they're getting into the age of kind of 25, really. So when you're looking at that and you're looking at a 10-year-old versus a 16 versus a 21-year-old, and they're still going through that process of kind of development mentally, and then you throw an impressionable young person with that perpetrator, and how that kind of can stunt growth under the concept of them being given this responsibility. And it's this very mixed up kind of, I'm young within my own right, I'm still developing, however I'm given this responsibility of an adult, and that is appealing within itself in the grooming process, but also for us just remembering that we are still working with children, though they might not present as a 13-year-old, and we are dealing with a 13-year-old that's probably presenting as a 17-year-old, and is presenting as, like we said, we've got the wannabes, and you've got a wannabe 13-year-old, but just being mindful that they are still that 13-year-old child, and keeping that in mind.
Yeah, and I suppose the route to that, and although I think I use the word wannabe first, I don't like that word, because quite often there's a reason why that they are the way they are. there's a reason why they're a wannabe, and quite often that comes down to not a simple thing, but I'll say it as it is, peer pressure for a lot of young people, especially within community. Aisha has asked a really interesting question in the chat around plec, poultry and karma, and the fact that there's an increase in crime rate and violence within those communities. And you know, it's a fair question. What is being done to raise awareness on crime and exploitation? And you're right, it's sad that you don't see any presence in these areas. I think Caris and I can answer this question maybe jointly. I'm just going to have to go off camera 1 minute. So I don't know if you want to just start off, Caris. I'll be 1 minute.
No worries. Yeah, so in terms of poultry, plec, karma, that's probably a good 30% of what we do at the minute, and within our team. So we do see the increase in crime rates amongst crimes amongst the young people at the minute, and it's not something. So I'm just trying to read. I have all these groups taken. Okay, so yeah, so there's a lot of things that are happening in silo. So we'll be aware of. So part of my role is to kind of look at what is actually happening and trying to answer that question as to what is going on and how are we collectively, as a partnership team, kind of tackling violence. Because what you'll realise is that it has to be a partnership approach, because you're going to have to use your third sector, you're going to have to use police, you're going to have your council partners as well. And one of the things that I think we do in Walsall is that we can respond. We could respond and put things in place after things have happened. And I think it's about looking at our proactive kind of responses and what we can do to prevent and reduce that from happening. Now, I think there are things that are happening, but we just need to connect and get that communication basis so we can see what is actually happening. So, for example, you know, something came to our attention, popped in my email, and I sent it over to some people in my team. It's like, oh, did you know this is happening? And it's obviously been ongoing in poultry, and it's a good project that's kind of going on, but wasn't aware of it. So I think one of the things that I want to do in the work that me and Mike are doing is pulling together what organisations are functioning in those communities, what are they doing, but then bringing us together to be like, okay, well, you're doing this and you're doing that, and building up that kind of professional network where we are sharing the kind of good practice and sharing what is going on, and also seeing where the gaps are. So myself and Mike are in the beginning stages really, and looking at plec and karma poultry and looking at what is going on. I know that Mike's got quite a lot of experiences working in those areas and has got a few connections there, but it's about really coordinating what's going on. I know at the minute there is some provisions for schools, so I know that there's some organisations that are going out to schools and doing some exploitation workshops. I know that for ourselves, we're working with families and individuals from a social care perspective within those areas. Street teams at the minute have got an offer for any young person's parents who's been affected by violence in those areas. They can access support. There is ongoing support, but what I think is happening is that it's not communicated. So, for example, would you necessarily know, Aisha, that street teams have got this offer? Would you necessarily know that there is a anti-violence program going on with schools? Would you? And I think one of the things that we've got to work on is sharing that information and building up what's already in place, and when we can see the gaps, filling it. The VRU were funded that with street teams, and that's short term. I think it ends at the end of March, but I think so that's quite recent. So I think it's something that we kind of need to look at collectively, sharing that knowledge with partners. So things like this that we're doing today is useful to kind of gain those contacts, but I think we need to look at a way of broadening that out a bit further. I know that there is a police teams that are looking at kind of the violence aspect of stuff, and they are doing some low level kind of mapping of key individuals and seeing how they can look at kind of targeting those as well. So there is things that are happening, but not necessarily things that we would see. I think in terms of where you've said, I know that Mike will be able to add further to that, but in terms of you saying that there's groups that have got funding, but they're not facilitating anything that would engage the youth. I think, you know, not to be and this isn't necessarily to be malicious or anything, but I think sometimes it is worth finding out who they're funded by and reporting those concerns, because I think, you know, if you're an individual where you can see something's happening or not happening and you're aware of the organisations who have got that funding, sometimes it is worth contacting the funders with your concerns, and at least then it can go from top down and that can be addressed, or even just setting up a meeting as well with them before that and just saying, oh, I just want to know what you're doing in the area. I want to know how you facilitate your young people, etc. Because I know that in the past, I've not necessarily seen a presence with a certain organisation. However, through having a conversation with them and figuring out how they work, realising, oh, your referrals are coming through the school process. So even though I'm working in the social care industry, I'm not seeing what you're doing because I'm not within the schools. However, understanding that they were taking numerous referrals from a school pathway. So I think contacting the funders, but just before that, having a conversation with the organisations individually and just saying, I just want to understand what you're doing, how we can work together, etc. And you might be able to get a bit more context. And then failing that, if you can still can't see anything happening, go on to the funders.
That's some great advice there, Keris. Thank you for that. I think it's interesting as well because for me, I don't want to second guess what communities are about or what young people are thinking. I'd rather have that conversation with young people within their community if they want that. And I think that's the other thing as well. Sometimes we bypass young people, our communities, and we just think we know what's best for you because of this, and this. And I think quite often understanding community is about having those conversations, but not just with people that are adults, but also young people, children, families, local businesses, children's centres if they're in community, and having that conversation so that we can start to get a picture, because if not, all we're doing is firefighting. And I think for me, some of the violence and serious youth violence that's happened in Walsall over the last couple of years has been a knock-on effect of something that's happened previous. But because we haven't got bodies of professionals within those communities, we just don't know what's going on. So when it kicks off, we react. But then, and I'm not making excuses, but we react until something else kicks off, and then we react to that, and it just goes on like that. And for me, there has to be a way of empowering local people, not to be snitches and grasses, far from it, but to be able to be a voice within their area. You know, I come into Walsall at 8:30 in the morning. I leave maybe 7:30 at night, but I go home. My home isn't in Walsall. We need to start listening to people within communities of all ages so that we can understand what's going on. And, you know, for some young people, they enjoy hanging out on a street corner. I'll raise my hand up. I were one of those young people. If it hadn't been for a youth worker working with me, I probably wouldn't be doing this job now. So it's also about identifying positive role models within community as well. You know, so it's about raising aspiration in that's sort of for me the key for that. We've we've got a couple of more slides to go. Are we going at the right pace for everyone? Is this sort of what you're expecting? Please, you know, Caris and I are not experts by any stretch of the imagination. We'll be honest and transparent with you. If we don't know, we don't know, but we'll do our best to to work things out and get those answers to you. Okay. So there's something that I want us to look at. This is something that I think Caris and I have spoken about quite often. But when we're working with young people, quite often, especially young people that are victims of criminal exploitation, we kind of see these 5 attitudes or approaches. So I just want to go through this with you very quickly, and then if there's any questions, then let's talk it out. But there is a question that I want us to think about, which is how, as professionals, do we work with young people who display these attitudes? So the first attitude that I want to maybe mention is the condemnation of condemners. So this is where young people have a sense of, like, it's not fair, you know, kind of that Kevin and Perry kind of attitude. They're picking on me because of this and this, and so I had to do it to stop them from picking on me. And for me, I hear this in various different ways all the time when working with young people. The denial of injury. So it's almost like they justify the reason why they had to do what they did. So I only hit him once, or in relation to county lines, it can be, well, you know what, I had to do it because of X, Y, and Z. So it isn't just denial of injury, it's sort of the denial of the action that they've taken as well. Denial of the victim. We've heard this, I think, this week. Well, you know what? They were in the wrong. They were asking for it. I had to save face. I had to save rep. So what I had to do were, you know, give them a good beating. That denial that the victim was actually in the wrong. Denial of responsibility. So they blame another factor, such as, oh, we went out on the lash and we had a few pints to drink, or we were smoking weed, or whatever, and then they came into our space and did this and this. So the blame sort of, I suppose, the substance on the way they reacted, and appeal of higher loyalties. So this for me is an interesting one. So young people claim the rule of law had to be ignored, basically because the issues were greater than law. So in other words, young people were prepared to commit GBH or ABH or carry a weapon or whatever because maybe someone told them to, or because they didn't feel safe or whatever. And the fact that they were standing up for race or religion or the community or whatever. And in fairness, we've probably in a week by week working with young people, we see the majority of these kind of reasons why young people do it, and it's kind of an attitude that runs through their dialogue with us as workers. So I suppose for me, the question is, how do we work with young people when they kind of have this almost like tunnel vision view of why they've done what they've done without actually taking other people's thoughts and considerations into account? So that's a question that we can either discuss now, or you can put in chat or whatever. Yeah, and I think you're right. there's a lot of desensitization going on, and I think you did spell it right-ish. And to the level of violence displayed as well. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think the desensitization comes because maybe they see it themselves. And what's interesting is, and something that we haven't looked at today, and we won't have time to, is around the trauma that's linked to all these aspects of thoughts or actions, because each one of these has a traumatic effect on young people. I worked with a young person who was involved in quite a violent incident going back 5-6 years ago. And one of the things that he shared with me, and I'm grateful that he did, were after the violent incident, he couldn't sleep. And when he did sleep, he had sort of recurring dreams going on, like flashbacks of what happened. But he couldn't talk to his parents about that because he were already sort of in the doghouse because of what he'd done. He couldn't talk to his peers about that because they kind of encouraged him to do that. He couldn't talk to police about that because, in his words, there was a mistrust. And so there was a sense in which he kind of talked to us because of that trusting appropriate adult. And so I suppose what I got from that was the fact that we don't understand the trauma that's linked to some of these, and that's something that we need to get to the root of too. But quite often young people will only share if they trust the person they're sharing with. So just interestingly enough, this is actually a theory. It's a criminology theory. The reason why I didn't put it up was because it might have put people off. So it's called the neutralization theory by a guy called David Matzer. He actually put this theory together in the 1960s when he did some research about adult males in prison. And so in the 60s, he was seeing these attitudes of adult males in, if you like, confinement, where rights have been, or some of the rights have been taken away. And it's interesting that now we're seeing these attitudes in young people out on the street, or some young people out on the street. So that's just something to think about. And if we go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just looking at the chat where PCR is put in there that there's some trauma-informed practice going across police to help them consider trauma when they're kind of working with young people, which I think is really good. And that will be key to kind of the engagement of the neighbourhood teams really across those areas where we're seeing it. We've got the normalising of violence through social media, which I think you spoke about a little bit, Mike, earlier. Free access to porn, which doesn't help. We know that there's a high correlation between watching porn and violence, etc. And we've just got attitudes towards young people have changed, often not seeing children as children, which increases the chances of exploitation. And as well, alongside that, we do know there's a study, especially across the US, which looks at the adultification of young people and how young people are viewed, and that they're often seen as a lot older than what they are based off the way that they carry themselves. And I would argue that these characteristics can also kind of make them present as older as well, and the repercussions of that across the criminal justice system and across the education system, which means that they're often penalised with a higher kind of, they've been penalised or they're treated as adults when really we're taking away the fact that they are a 13-year-old child and they are kind of getting harsher sentence. They are more punitive to these young people because they are seen as adults. So I think that's a good point around attitudes towards young people. But one of the things that I think we should consider as well is that sometimes a lot of that is embedded in fear as well, because the role of teaching staff, the role of professionals is changing. So before, if you think about it, 15 years ago, being a teacher, when would you have to really be dealing with students stabbing each other? You know, a child who's off school because they've just been seriously injured, trying to manage the school environment. When was it in school that you had to have hot topics around knife crime and you had to really deal with this as a reoccurring theme? When, as a, you know, as a practitioner, you've got to think when you intervene in to split up a fight, has one of them got a weapon? So I think a lot of it is embedded in fear, and I think if we can help people to know how to manage it, we've got our normal safeguarding models, but I think the more we get out there and we kind of spread and use a contextual approach to safeguarding, I think that will help give a little bit more confidence to practitioners so they know how to deal with these things, because traditionally exploitation and violence doesn't always fit in your traditional safeguarding models, because a lot of the time the risk is outside of the home. So if we are focusing on locations opposed to the individual children, not that we're not going to focus on them, but we look at the contextual side of things, that will kind of help to reduce stuff. I think from a policing perspective, from a social work perspective, the more contextual we become when we're looking at working with these children, it'll be more helpful for them in the long run, I think. There's ACE training through the NSPCC as well, transport on there.
Yeah, and I think everything that you've put within the comments, and Kerris, what you said is spot on. And it's important that we try and understand the context that the young person is in, not just within the home, but within community, within education, within sort of his peer group or her peer group, etc., etc. And sometimes we don't see that. And one of the things that Kerris and I talk about often when we have sort of deeper, meaningful conversations is that, you know, so often we get too focused on the actions that the young person does or doesn't do, that we don't just have a conversation about, you know, what did you have for tea? Where do you want to be in 5 years' time? What football team do you support? What are your hobbies? What are your interests? When was the last time you went on holiday? You know, those sort of almost like, and it's not about normalizing it, it's about understanding the young person as a person. Just like, you know, when I meet friends, we have these conversations. I'm not saying that young people are friends, but sometimes it's like, oh, that's Mike, that's the exploitation guy, or that's Kerris, that's the violent girl, or whatever. But and we do the same with young people. Oh, that's a young person. They've been missing for 6 weeks. We need to do this, this, and this. Well, actually, we need to just sit and have a conversation with that young person and get to know the young person as a young person. The problematic thing with that is simply the fact that quite often it's time related, and we're all busy people, and you know, you sort of go from one person to another sometimes. But if we can show that little bit of interest, you know, in who they are, then it goes a long way. So I agree. Seeing young people as people is crucial.
And I think I'm a big one of my strong beliefs. I mean, it's my opinion. It could be wrong. Is that I think everything that we often see, whether it's exploitation, whether it's violence, that it's often, if not always, down to an unmet need with the young person. So I don't think a lot of the time, I think if their needs are met, whether that be, you know, we have to identify what that need is, but if their need is met, then I think a lot of the time it reduces vulnerability. And I think we don't see a spark in violence, because whether or not that might be as simple as their need to feel respect, a need to have that autonomy, their need to have that, you know, the need to be loved, the need to be cared for, all these kind of basic needs that we kind of look, I think, and you're only going to know that they're not being met if you connect with that young person. You're not going to know that from a form. You're not going to know that through one encounter. It is that unpicking. So I think, like you saying, Mike, exploring that, but exploring that, trying to figure out what their actual needs are and are they actually being met. Because I think a lot of the time when we're working with young people, even when we're working with adults, there's an area of unmet need which which was taken advantage of and was fulfilled by a perpetrator, or it's been taken away and it's produced kind of a violent response because young people don't necessarily have those skills at this point to kind of cope with it differently. I think as adults, and we can take advantage of the fact that we're adults and we've grown up in a different way, and that we haven't had that exposure to the level of violence that they do on a regular basis. So we're not used to having social media where we're seeing videos of people being chased with machetes, and so when we see it, we have an instant shock and an instant kind of, I worked with someone recently, and that it just couldn't they couldn't get it into their head how young people could be so violent. The same child that sat down and I've worked with has also done this completely. It's almost like two separate people. And I think what we can do is kind of demonize the young person as well, because then we're like, they're desensitized to this. So then we then almost demonize them because we are then saying, well, how can you do such a thing? How can you be so violent? How can you do so that, the violence at times can be quite horrific, or where we're looking at other people, it's like, how can you be involved in this? How can you be attached to it? And we can almost do what they do, but in a different kind of way. We demonize them, they normalize the behavior. But I think when we're looking at the process and their experience and their lived experience, to me, even as a professional, I'm not as shocked as I was that if someone came to me today and said, there was stabbing in Walsall yesterday and a young person's on life support, would I necessarily have the initial shock that I would have had a year or two ago? Probably not. I wouldn't. The shock value has gone. However, the care and the concern's still there and it's still present, but the shock value has gone down because it's becoming more common. And I think young people probably see that on a different level, that probably times 10, times 100 to me when they're seeing it on their social media. So I think as a professional, it's trying to have that kind of empathetic approach to not demonize them for being so desensitized to it, but understand why, and not see them as kind of these risky kind of, oh my gosh, fearful children, but also recognizing they do come with a risk. Do you know what I mean? They do come with a risk, and acknowledging that, but not demonizing them in the same breath. And it's quite hard to do and keep that balance, especially when you've got violence and fear involved.
Yeah, thanks for that, Caris. I'm aware of time. We're going to move on. We've only got sort of 2 more slides to go, but thank you for hanging in there and participating. It's really good. What we want to look at very, very quickly is so around working with young people that are victims of exploitation, whether that's sexual exploitation or criminal exploitation. I suppose the question is, what does good practice look like? And so Caris and I have done a lot of talking, and we've got some examples we can share. But we just thought it would be good to open the floor to you to share anything, either in the comments, or if you're happy to speak, then yeah, by all means, share. Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, thanks, Amelia. That's not a problem. Yeah, I think keeping open-minded and not judging a situation is a really good point. Sometimes it's difficult as a human being to do that. You know, sometimes we bring our personal into our professional life, but it's really important about that open-mindedness and not judging as well.
These are all really good suggestions.
Yeah.
I can see the theme as well of like being, like we're talking about feeling judged. And I think that's something that we hear quite a lot, isn't it, Mike? That young people do feel quite judged a lot of the time by their communities. So therefore they create their own community.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that idea as well, by consistency.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we maybe talk about this a lot, but there's also something about being honest and transparent with them, with young people too. It's no good sugarcoating things. Sometimes it's about having to be honest and say, look, there's going to come a time when, if you carry on down this path, I'll either be speaking at your funeral, visiting you in hospital, or visiting you in jail. And sort of having that honesty to say that sometimes helps as well.
I was going to say as well, creating opportunities as well. Because I think one of the things that we can do, we can understand really well, we can get their context and we can do all the rest of it. But I think you touched on it already, Mark, about raising aspirations. Yeah, raising aspirations, but creating tangible opportunities for them as well. So as much as we can understand them, we can tell them the different way, we can understand and say, you know, this is going to end up this way, this way, this way, but let's give them an alternative narrative, but also a tangible opportunity. And I know Mike's quite good at this in terms of creating opportunities for young people. Is it about, you know, they're interested in a certain type of career path, and it's like, okay, well, let's give you the opportunity to do something different, because they might not necessarily have that support network around them to do that, or putting the right people in place to help them. So making those referrals to, you know, Black Country Impact, for example, so that we can help create opportunities for them.
And I think for me, good practice is about recognizing that I might not be the answer at that moment in time, but I might be that one trusted adult that young people will talk to and have a question that I can't answer. And so, you know, being online with such creative people today, hopefully we can build those links and, you know, form those partnerships so that, you know, together we can at least be a form of an answer to a young person. You know, I think a lot of times professional ego comes in the way of our work. Like, yeah, this is my young person. No one else will talk to them without me being there. And I've seen that with professionals. And it's about, well, actually, it's not about you. It's about the young person you're working with, and you know. So not being the answer sometimes is the right answer.
I mean, one of the things as well, Mike, you're just saying that there is a directory. It is outdated as well. It is a bit behind, so it was done later on last year. So some of the things on there, just be cautious that the funding might have run out. I'll give a quick run through it, but I have got a directory of some services across Walsall, so I don't know if people would find that useful for me to share. I could send it to you, Mike, and then you could send it out, or if I've got the emails, I can send them out myself, just so that everyone's kind of got access to that. So if you do want to refer into different you know, different services across Walsall, you could look at them. Some of them do come at a cost, some of them are free, but it's just worth probably casting your eyes out just to kind of follow on from what you just said, Mike.
Yeah. I think otherwise, you know, the greatest misjustice sometimes we can do, as already spoken about, is not filling out assessments properly. That's kind of the mundane side of things, because in not doing that, we're kind of doing an injustice to the young person we're working with. So getting to know the young people that we're working with, so that we can put on paper sort of the reality for that young person, not how we see that reality for that young person is a good one. Also, you know, there's times when I might spend half a day with a young person, talking, doing activities, etc., etc. But it's being aware that after that, he or she might be out with peers, might be drawn into something else. And so it's being aware of our limitations when working with that young person. There's some young people I wish I could spend a whole week with, because you just see the vulnerability and the need that's there. But that isn't my role in that respect. I'd love it to be sometimes, because you just want to. But it's understanding that our limitation is there and that we're only part of that young person's world. And I always remember a youth worker saying to me that it isn't about being in that young person's pocket 24/7. It's about when that young person's in our presence, how we create memories and make a change and a difference. And I think for me, creating memories for a young person that are positive, that he or she will talk about in years to come, that they'll, you know, talk to the friends about, is good practice in itself. We're going to move on because we've nearly done. There's one last thing that I'd like to ask of you as a group. There will be an evaluation that comes out sort of corporately, but you know, I'm a great believer in reflective practice and how we reflect on the work that we do with young people, parents, carers, and other professionals. And so this is just something that I'd ask of you. You don't have to do it, but it'd be helpful for us to know, what did you find useful? What made you think? And I suppose the most important thing is there anything else you would like to discuss? In conversation with our line manager, Katie Story-Young, she did say that if there was enough maybe uptake, that maybe we do something like this again in 2 to 3 months' time, where maybe people can come and share good practice and talk. It doesn't have to be during Exploitation Awareness Week or County Lines Intensification Week. We can have these conversations whenever. So if that's something that you think you benefit from, don't have to be 2 hours, and it don't have to be in the morning, it can be whenever, then let us know in the email too. But I think we'd appreciate it if you let us know what you found useful, what made you think, and is there anything else you'd like to discuss. And I think we've come to the end now, so all that's left is to say thank you for your time. Thank you for taking 2 hours out of what could be a very, very busy day. It's been great to meet